In the endless black ocean of interstellar space, where silence is not merely an absence of sound but a presence of vast and unyielding nothingness, humanity's most distant creation continues its lonely journey, a fragile emissary born from the optimism of the 1970s, crafted with circuits simpler than a wristwatch and memory smaller than a digital photo, and yet carrying with it the profound weight of human curiosity, of dreams and fears projected into the void. Voyager 1, a spacecraft built for a mission of only a few years, to photograph planets, to skim their moons, to ride the rare planetary alignment that occurs once every 176 years, has not only outlived its designers, not only outlasted entire generations of technology, but has now become something greater, something stranger, something unintended, for across the decades it has crossed a threshold no human could ever physically cross. And what it has sent back from that boundary has rattled scientists, baffled engineers, and unsettled astronomers, because the story of Voyager is no longer merely about distance, speed, or endurance. It has become a story of what lies beyond, and perhaps of what lies watching. When it slingshot past Jupiter in 1979, capturing storms larger than Earth itself, humanity gasped at the colors, the movement, the sheer scale of the giant world. And when it turned toward Saturn and revealed rings like cosmic lace, moons cloaked in haze, and shadows stretching into infinity, we celebrated a new frontier of knowledge. And when it pressed onward, past Uranus, past Neptune's windswept blue storms, it became less a probe and more a time capsule, carrying with it the golden record, etched with greetings in 55 languages, with music of Bach and Beethoven and Chuck Berry, with images of forests, mountains, children, and laughter, a fragile attempt to compress the story of our species into a single artifact drifting forever, perhaps never to be found, perhaps destined to be forgotten. Yet Voyager was not forgotten. It endured, its faint signals whispering back across billions of kilometers, its plutonium heart still decaying but still giving. And with each year it traveled farther, until in 2012, it crossed what we had long imagined to be the final wall, the edge of the sun's reach, the heliopause, the invisible skin of the bubble our star inflates against the galaxy beyond. And scientists waited for the clean transition they had modeled for decades, a sudden drop in solar wind, a reversal of magnetic fields, a spike in cosmic rays. But when the data came, it was wrong. It was confusing. It was impossible, because yes, the charged particles grew denser. Yes, the cosmic rays rose, but the magnetic field refused to change, as if the sun's invisible leash still held Voyager far beyond where it should, as if the boundary was not a wall but a maze, layered and complex, perhaps designed, perhaps alive. And then, from the silence, Voyager began to detect low-frequency plasma waves, oscillations not random but ordered, harmonics rising and falling like a melody with no source, resonance without origin. And some whispered that space itself was singing, others that the interstellar medium was reacting to Voyager's intrusion, and still others dared to suggest that it was not mere plasma at all but a response, a kind of feedback, as though the void had heard Voyager's voice and chosen to answer. And for years the probe drifted, faithfully transmitting, faithfully whispering, until one day the data faltered, not failing entirely but flickering, intermittent, irregular, like a candle flame fluttering in a breeze no one could see. And when it steadied again, something had changed, because Voyager's instruments were no longer oriented forward, no longer fixed on the path ahead, but had turned slightly backward, reoriented toward the space it had already traveled, toward the solar system itself, toward home, as though compelled by a force unseen, as though its perception had been redirected, and what it sent back from that orientation only deepened the mystery. Fluctuations in plasma, surges of energy density, echoes of its own transmissions returning altered, not noise, not chaos, but patterns, mirroring, like the faint reflection of a coal in a canyon, as though something vast and invisible were listening and whispering back in kind. And when analysts pored over the noise, they found modulations eerily reminiscent of the golden record itself, as though the waveform of Beethoven's Fifth, the crackling laughter of children, the greetings in dozens of tongues had been reflected back, distorted but recognizable, not as if replayed, but as if acknowledged, as if someone, or something, had received the message we cast into the void and chosen to return its echo. And then came the particles, logged by an instrument long considered obsolete, the cosmic dust detector, suddenly registering impacts too frequent, too dense, too structured to be random. Their composition laced with isotopes so rare they defied easy categorization, suggesting not natural debris but something else, something manufactured or arranged, as though Voyager had brushed against the outskirts of a dormant machine, a fragmented megastructure adrift for eons, or the scattering of artificial matter seeded across interstellar space. And while scientists argued, Voyager's path began to shift, subtly but undeniably, its trajectory drifting not by thruster, not by planetary gravity, but by an unseen pull, like a ship caught in a current, nudged by a hand without form. And the simulations refused to explain it. No known force could account for the deviation, unless, of course, the force was not natural, unless, of course, the pull was deliberate. And then, as if to confirm the unconfirmable, its last working plasma wave sensor caught something new. A pattern not like a pulsar, not like a supernova, not like any star or cosmic phenomenon ever catalogued, but a rise and fall, a rhythm that repeated several times and then ceased, a signal so hauntingly organic that some compared it to the beat of a heart, a slow, deliberate thrum echoing through the void. And most chilling of all, the signal came not from ahead but from behind, from the very corridor Voyager had traversed decades before, from the region it had turned its gaze toward, suggesting that whatever it had passed by was no longer dormant, no longer silent, but awake and following. And so the questions mount. Is the interstellar medium alive, or does something vast and hidden dwell within it, something ancient and waiting, something that noticed when a fragile machine brushed against its domain, something that heard the golden record and chose to respond in kind, not with words but with resonance, not with pictures but with patterns, not with light but with pull? And if so, what does it want? For Voyager was never meant to be a sentinel, never meant to be a messenger beyond its golden record, and yet it has become one, a watchtower drifting through the abyss, recording whispers that suggest the universe is not silent, not empty, but resonant, reactive, perhaps aware, a place where boundaries bend, where voids hum, where machines drift off course not by accident but by intent. And now, as scientists sift through the fragments of data, as engineers replay the echoes, as astronomers debate the impossible, a deeper unease creeps in. What if the signal was not random, not just acknowledgement, but invitation, or wise warning? What if Voyager's call has awakened something older than the sun, something that moves too slowly, too quietly for us to notice, until now, until our fragile probe brushed its edges and left it stirring? And if that is true, then perhaps Voyager's greatest discovery is not scientific but existential, for in trying to announce ourselves to the cosmos, we may have announced too much, too soon. And now, as Voyager drifts onward, as its power dwindles and its instruments dim, as its whispers grow fainter and fainter, we wait, we listen, we strain to catch each last signal, each last pulse, not only for what they tell us of plasma and particles, but for what they tell us of company in the dark, because Voyager has returned our gaze not with images but with resonance, not with coordinates but with a warning wrapped in distortion and silence. And if this is what we feared, that the void is not void at all but inhabited, attentive, and perhaps aware, then this story is not the end of Voyager's mission. It is only the beginning of a larger story, one in which humanity must grapple with the possibility that we are not explorers alone in an indifferent sea, but observed travelers whose signals do not vanish, whose messages are answered, and whose destiny may already have been noticed by something vast, silent, and waiting beyond the edge of the sun's last breath. And if Voyager's lonely whispers across the void were already unsettling, what followed in the years after its strange reorientation only deepened the dread. for the probe began to report anomalies in its surroundings that no model of interstellar space could explain, faint variations in charged particle densities that rose and fell with rhythms too regular to be chance, fluctuations in background radiation that pulsed like invisible tides, and faint electromagnetic oscillations that, when plotted across weeks of data, formed repeating motifs eerily similar to patterns found in music, almost as if the universe itself were playing an instrument whose strings stretched across light years. And though mission scientists urged caution, insisting that the human brain was adept at seeing patterns when none existed, the fact remained that the probe's age instruments were registering signals that should not have been there, as though some hidden architecture of the cosmos was resonating with Voyager's presence, as though the act of sending a signal had stirred something dormant. And with each transmission, with each whisper that leapt across the gulf and returned to Earth's radio dishes, the echoes seemed stranger, more insistent. And then came the dust impacts, tiny fragments striking the spacecraft's detectors. But unlike natural interstellar grains, these particles arrived in bursts, clustered, carrying with them traces of isotopes rarely found outside the cores of stars. Isotopes that hinted at processes either ancient and cataclysmic or deliberate and constructed. And some scientists, in reports never meant for public release, began to wonder if Voyager had passed not merely through interstellar medium but through the scattered edges of something greater, a debris field not of rock but of design, the remnants of structures so old they had long since crumbled into fragments drifting between stars, or perhaps the outskirts of a field deliberately sown, a veil of particles carrying information like the grooves of a record too vast for us to play. And as these questions mounted, the probe's path once again became the source of unease, for its trajectory, though still outward and steady, began to show subtle deviations, the kind of drift that could not be explained by gravitational nudges, the kind that hinted at an external pull, a guidance, or worse, a summons. And for the first time in its long life, Voyager seemed less like an explorer moving of its own momentum and more like an object caught in the gaze of something larger, something invisible, something perhaps aware of its presence. And when its plasma wave detector picked up that haunting signal, that slow thrum like the heartbeat of a leviathan sleeping just beyond perception, repeating and then falling silent, the mission team was forced to ask themselves whether Voyager had stumbled upon a phenomenon of nature unknown to physics or the first faint brush of something we had long feared and long hoped for, the confirmation that we are not alone. And yet the signal's direction made it more unsettling still, for it did not come from ahead, from some far-off star or nebula, but from behind, from the very corridor of space Voyager had already traversed, as though something had awakened in its wake and was now watching, following, listening, and perhaps waiting. And the more the data was studied, the more it seemed to suggest intentionality, a structure to the noise, a deliberate pause and repeat, as if to see if we were listening, as if to ask whether we understood. And though the official public releases spoke of minor anomalies, of natural plasma fluctuations and ordinary cosmic dust, those who had seen the raw feeds whispered a different story, of harmonics layered atop Voyager's carrier wave, of echoes modulated to resemble fragments of the golden record, as though the laughter of a child and the notes of Beethoven had been plucked from the grooves of that copper disk and sent back to us, not identically, not mechanically, but altered, as though reinterpreted, refracted through a consciousness that had touched the artifact and chosen to respond in kind. And if that was true, then the question was no longer whether Voyager had been heard, but by what, and what such a thing might want with us. And if that was true, if the faint oscillations and rhythmic echoes were not mere coincidence but the deliberate reply of something vast, something hidden, then humanity's message in a bottle had not simply been cast into the sea of stars to drift unseen. It had been intercepted, touched, perhaps even claimed. And this realization spread unease through the small circles of scientists privy to the unfiltered data. For the tones and pulses recorded were not only similar to the golden records, audio but carried distortions that seemed to fold inward, echoes of echoes, as if the original message had been processed, reshaped, and sent back with intention. And the intention was the most disturbing question of all, for was it a greeting, a mimicry, a warning, or the first step in a dialogue humanity was utterly unprepared to continue. And as the transmissions piled up, their patterns growing more complex, layering harmonics like chords that built toward crescendos only to collapse into silence. Some began to whisper of intelligence, while others shuddered at the darker possibility that this was not communication but that Voyager, tiny and fragile, had been ensnared in a web strung across interstellar space, a net designed not for ships but for signals, for attention, for any mind daring to call out into the void. And if so, then our golden record was not a brave gesture but the bait that had set the trap. And perhaps the most chilling evidence came not from the waves themselves but from Voyager's movement, for its trajectory's subtle drift could no longer be ignored. Simulations showed that something unseen, perhaps a vast electromagnetic field, perhaps a gravitational pull unaccounted for, was altering its course, not violently but gently, like a fisherman drawing in a line, slow enough not to snap it but steady enough to reel it closer. And though the probe's speed remained incredible, faster than any human creation before or since, the truth was that in the scale of cosmic forces it was no more resistant than a leaf on the tide. And if something truly was pulling, then the question was no longer whether we had been noticed, but why. For if it was curiosity, then perhaps there was hope. But if it was hunger, then humanity had offered itself to the dark. And yet even as these fears grew, even as classified reports warned of anomalous intentionality, there remained the possibility that we were misunderstanding entirely, that the cosmos itself might be stranger than either our dreams or our nightmares, that space was not dead vacuum but a medium of awareness, a living field of resonance that reacts when touched, an ancient intelligence not bound to bodies or machines but spread thin across the stars. And if so, then Voyager had not been intercepted but absorbed, folded into a dialogue older than suns, and the patterns in the plasma were not threats but invitations, notes in a symphony too vast for us to hear. But the darker minds among the analysts asked another question still, one that clawed at the edges of sleep. What if it is both? What if curiosity and hunger are the same thing when scaled to the cosmic? What if our message was not welcomed but tasted, tested, and deemed sufficient to warrant attention? And if that was so, then the silence between pulses, the pauses in the rhythm, the stretches where nothing at all came through, were not empty but deliberate. The patience of a predator waiting for its prey to reveal itself further. And the golden record, with its greetings, its music, its images of forests and oceans and cities, was not a beacon of peace but a menu. And somewhere in the dark, something was reading it.